When I was a child, there were so many families in this place, and people. And we used to walk to each other's homes because from each home there were paths through the woods. And nothing was pretty much clear. Now you go through the area and everything's grown up.
After the Civil War, out of necessity or by choice, many African American families established small communities. These freedmen's villages sprouted by the thousands throughout the South. In Orange County, Virginia, 15 such communities have been documented. Places with names like Tibbstown, Little Egypt, Freetown, and Little Petersburg. Despite numerous challenges, these communities generally thrived and flourished well into the 1960s, but then faded into obscurity as economic conditions improved and job opportunities opened up in the cities.
And this is what Little Petersburg was originally, a freedman's settlement. And we saw Little Petersburg, the piece from the 20s, 30s, and 40s. The forest was full of houses, and many of them still had the contents. And it appeared as if everyone simply one day walked away and left everything just in time. And we found some structures, and one was called the Fisherman's Lodge.
Yet in Little Petersburg, the spirit of that original community lives on, mostly because of a church and its congregation.
It's important that we understand when we reference freedom that most African Americans had been enslaved. It's very important, however, to understand most people in America did not own or enslave persons. In fact, many Southerners lived in abject poverty in much the same way as the enslaved. They didn't have adequate medical care. They were not literate. They lived in shacks in much the way the enslaved. And you say, well, David, are you saying that the enslaved and the free poor whites were the same in terms of the quality of life? I'm not saying that, because the absence of freedom over your destiny, control over your destiny, is a very precious and important piece. In fact, two of the things that were most frightening for African Americans who were enslaved, is based on what is reported, is that the notion that you could be separated. So funerals and weddings were a great upheaval and fearful. It caused fear for the enslaved because they knew they could be sold or separated or given away. With this in mind, the settlement, like Little Petersburg, was a place, I'm sure, of great joy and great hope because it was an opportunity. We're free, we can start a new life.
Although the Civil War had ended, this newfound freedom for African Americans presented many challenges.
Right before President Lincoln died, he and General Sherman put together a plan that they would distribute land to the recently freed African Americans. After the Civil War, the plans, the dream, if you please, was to incorporate African Americans as citizens, walking hand in hand, working side by side with European Americans, or some people say white. That didn't happen exactly as planned because there were a number of forces that impacted this. The North and the South were very war-weary. People had lost far more. The South lost more than they thought. The North lost more than they thought. The economy in the South was turned on its head. The social situation was turned on its head. People were desperate in both groups. So the idea of a dream coming true was less than hopeful on the part of the European Americans or the whites. The Black Code came into existence in 1865, right after the Reconstruction Act was underway. And the Black Code began to really restrict the movements and the rights of the recently freed African Americans. For example, one Black Code indicated that within 3 to 4 weeks you had to have signed a contract with your former white employer or a white employer, which again was going to be an imbalanced contract. But one of the challenges with this was African Americans, for the most part, had never been allowed to read. I say for the most part. And so how could they enter into a contract that would be fair to them and to the former master if they could not read or write or comprehend what was on the paper? So that was a real challenge. The Democrat and Republican Party at that time are not as they are today. However, the Democrats in the early 1870s began to defund the places like Little Petersburg, in other words, the reconstruction efforts, so that it was not possible to continue the good work that had started. For example, many teachers had come in with teaching children and adults how to read and write. That was lost when they started defunding. By 1876, both parties had political platforms where they were saying our plan is to wash our hands in terms of the federal government paying for and managing Reconstruction, and instead let the states take that on. And that is what happened. By 1870, the Ku Klux Klan were in full regalia and full power. And they were a terrorist organization designed to intimidate and restrict the movements, the freedom, and the rights of the African Americans. In other words, many people wanted to reverse this notion that the African Americans were free and basically put them back into bondage.
One of the greatest challenges facing the newly emancipated slaves was that they were landless. They owned practically nothing. In some cases, their former owners became their benefactors by deeding over portions of their property to their former slaves. Such was the case with James Lawson Kemper.
Governor Kemper was born in 1823 and he died in 1895. And at best, I'll say he was a very complex and complicated man. He was a major landholder, and he was a major slave owner. He was also an attorney. He was in the House of Delegates. He was a delegate, and at one point in time, he was a Speaker of the House. And in fact, he was the Speaker of the House in the year that Virginia seceded from the Union. So the war starts in 1861 and it ends in 1865. He was a general during the Civil War. Although he spent most of his professional life in Madison County, he owned land all over. And he bought the land, which is now Walnut Hills. He bought it from a Bankhead family. That was the name of the family. And so he owned the land here long before he moved here. In 1874, he becomes governor of Virginia. And so he becomes governor in January of 1874. Although he never lived in Petersburg, when he became governor, up until that time in Petersburg, the city council was elected by the populace of the city. Now, thereafter, some white citizens wanted to basically disenfranchise blacks and not give them that power. Not only did they have the power to vote, there were actually black council members seated. So there was a proposal made in the House of Delegates that an appointed judge would then appoint the delegates, thus disenfranchising black people. Governor Kemper was initially in favor of that, but at some point he changed his mind and he vetoed that act. And the veto, they were not able to overturn the veto. So many people who wanted to disenfranchise the blacks were very upset, so much so that they hung him in effigy, which is sort of a lynching-esque move. The land that he owned, part of is where Little Petersburg is today. And we pretty much think that enslaved people lived on that site even prior to the Civil War and prior to him owning the property. So since we cannot find any other link to Kemper and Petersburg, and it was a very public thing that he did, Our theory is that Little Petersburg was named in honor of that event.
David Sides and Doug Myrick launched a deed search at the Orange County, Virginia clerk's office.
And our major goal was to see if we could find some of the earliest land transfers from white hands into African American hands. Obviously, before the end of the Civil War, blacks could not own land here in Virginia. By the way, our younger learners might need to know as well that most white women were not allowed to hold land in their own right either. And we were able to find a land deed. It was a trust document that went from Governor Kemper to a woman named Mary A. Freedman. Freedman is a very interesting last name for someone to have. Freedman meant, after the Civil War, that you were taking names saying, I am no longer a slave, I am a freed person. Most African Americans at the end of the Civil War took the names of the person who had owned them previously. We do not know, we were not able to find Mary Freedman in the census documents, but we were told that up in the Little Petersburg area, that would have kind of been off the beaten path, and it means that maybe everyone in that community would not have been part of a census. So we do not know whether Mary Freedman was African American for sure, of mixed heritage, or white, but there really aren't any white freedmans. One of the interesting things about the deeds are in chronological order, so you can look at what the deeds look like before and what the deeds look like afterwards. Most of the deeds were about half a page, and it would say you own the land from this apple tree to this spring, to this road. Hers goes on about twice as long as the deeds all around it. So it is our hypothesis that someone took Herculean efforts to secure this land in her name. And then the deed says, and this was in 1868, by the way, then the deed says upon her death, the land would be transferred to a Mr. Sampson Thompson. And that land was transferred to him in 1881. It must have been around the time that she died. So again, we don't know if this was a son, a brother, or some other relative, but at the time in antebellum South, many of the enslaved people were named after biblical characters or mythological characters. So it's a good guess that Samson was a man of color.
When we came back here, Bruce, it was during the wintertime.
During its heyday, there may have been as many as 15 different families living in Little Petersburg. One of the buildings was known as Fisherman's Lodge.
He said this was the old road here. All the roads have been moved around. Because part of the folklore is that the lodge was used in part as a social center, as a school, and possibly some folks think that it may have been used as a church prior to the construction of that Bethel Baptist Church that was built circa 1898, which we mentioned earlier.
We have a term that we use a lot in architectural history, which is an evolved structure. In other words, very few structures just sit and are sort of put into amber and stay exactly as they were when they were built in whatever years. The next point is what sort of nails, and okay, and no, that's a buildup of paint. So you see the round head, that's a wire nail. Using the thing at the angle, the light at the angle, is a great tool.
George, he sells jelly there on the...
Okay, we have skip sheathing here. And we have a ridge board, which again would argue probably early 20th century. I don't see any nails, so that would argue that there were no wooden shingles originally. And instead that the standing seam roof is probably original.
Where people went
maybe 2 more feet, 2.5 feet, okay.
We go there? Yeah. Okay.
Because everything that I can see here looks like it would be probably early 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
James Monroe was born in 1930. He was a small child when he moved into the Little Petersburg community.
I had 2 sisters and 4 brothers. There were 4 of us here.
So when your family moves here, because your family, you said, bought a home, do you remember, I would imagine you probably shared a bedroom with some of your brothers, or am I wrong?
Oh yeah, we had sometimes 2 sleep ahead and 1 sleep at the bottom.
Right, of course.
Yeah.
That was standard. So for heat in your room, what sort of heating system? It could be blankets, it could be a wood stove.
Blanket. My mother used to make her own quilt.
Ah.
And she's at the mill down here. She used to get the old sacks,
Yes.
and then they were colored.
Right.
And some of them were white. And she used to take them, and then she took old scrap clothes and made quilts and things up.
Wow, she was very innovative.
And my grandmother did the same thing.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're in the new home now. You're sharing the bedrooms like most people are with their brothers. What were your jobs there as a child? We're going to move on to your older
Well,
siblings.
we all had a job.
Yes.
My older boys and my sisters, they had to do the washing and mop the floors and things, and we was working outside.
Sure. And what were you
We had
doing?
doing the wood, getting the wood in, feeding the chicken, milking the cow.
So what time did your day start in the morning?
Oh, around 6 o'clock.
Right.
7 o'clock, 'cause we had to get ready. They had to do that before we go to school.
Right, I understand. Yeah. So what was bedtime, given all this hard work you did? I would imagine you weren't staying up.
Well, I think it was 8 o'clock.
I would imagine.
Yeah, and that was all night.
Right.
And sometimes we had to have a counter.
Right.
Did you have electricity in the house?
No, sir.
So how'd you see at night with the oil lamp?
A lamp and a counter.
But the very first car your family had was,
That was a Model T.
and do you know about when that was?
That was in the 30s. I mean, I was old enough to know it was a car, because most time it were horses, you know.
Now, talk to me about your water source. Did you, by chance, sort of spring?
Oh, we had to go. We had to get it from a spring.
Ah, I thought so.
Yeah, we had to get it from a spring. But then when we moved down here, it's a place still up here.
You mean up the hill, Little Petersburg?
No, it's down past the bottom, what the cattle guard, and like going over to Round Hill Farm.
Oh, I see.
And it's still there.
Oh, the spring.
And then later on, my father put a pipe in up there.
Mm-hmm.
And then he took the horse and made a furrow all the way down to the house, a little ways.
Right.
Then they put a pipe in there.
Right.
And then they put a spigot on the end. And then when that pipe filled up with water,
Right.
if it run out, we don't have no water. We have to wait till it fills back up.
The spring, the water level rose again. He brought plumbing into place. How about that? That's great.
And my father, see, he used to, well, didn't many people know it, but he used to make all the flour meal and stuff. Right down here, Mountain Mill.
When you first started living here, how many families were living here in Little Petersburg?
Oh, man, a lot of people in this area. Kids, roads used to be full of kids coming to Sunday school.
Can you tell them where people were baptized? Which is
Oh, yeah, we were baptized right in the Rapidan River, right back at the mill. And I tell you, we used to call it a chicken hole. That's what we were baptized in, that hole.
Right.
We used to call it a chicken hole.
What, because you were scared to go in it?
Yeah. Yeah, we used to be scared to go in it, you know.
How old were you when you started going to school here on Little Petersburg?
I think I was about 7 or 8 years old, I think.
Right. And where was school held in the beginning?
Right there in Petersburg.
In Petersburg. But was it connected with the structure they call Little Fisherman's Lodge?
Fisher Lodge.
So it did serve as a school.
Yeah.
Can you also share with folks who are not familiar with how education started, was everyone like in the first grade, or did you have people of different ages in the same room? Right.
Yeah, I think we, from the first grade to the 6th grade. I said we had about 20, 28 or 30 in that school up there.
And that would be with one adult instructor or more?
One teacher.
Right, right. Just so we know, was there a problem with behavior on the part of children, or was that sort of an understanding between the teacher and families that there would be order? I'm just wondering how.
Well, we would behave, you know.
Right, that's what I'm thinking.
I mean, we was good.
Right.
I mean, sometimes we may act up, you know, somebody may act up.
Right.
Yeah. But we were scared to act up.
That's what I was thinking.
Because if we get it at school and then get it at home, we get home.
Hey! That's what you think our techniques today, all right.
I mean, we'll get it too. But see, we had to walk from our community right up into the store right here. What we call Tucker Tea Room.
Right.
And we didn't have no bus. We had to ride in a cab. Ride in a cab from here, it was to the railroad station. Then we had to, from the railroad station, we had to walk all the way up to the school. Tucker Tea Room, that was a going place during Saturday night. And it had old Model T's and airplanes for power for the air conditioning and air coming.
Now, would you all go down there, or was that pretty much all white people only?
There, most of them were white, but it was a store too, see. That was open during the week. The Tucker Tea Room, I tell you, it'd be cars lined up all the way up here this old road to 15.
Yeah.
And part of the way down the road down here where I go home at. And when they start that engine up with the propeller, airplane propeller, you know. And that's what sucks the air through there to cool it off when all the people get in.
And did you play any sports yourself?
Oh yeah, baseball.
Baseball.
Now football, now we had no uniform, nothing. We had to play in our clothes.
So you've moved on, you're moving into teens now. You're still in school. When does someone approach you for your first job where they pay you something?
Oh, my first job was on well, beside my home, what I had to do.
Right.
But the man crossed the river that had a farm over there, and he offered me a job. I was 13 years old.
All right.
And he offered me a job. After mail run, he came down, picked his mail up, and asked me did I want to work. And I went up there, and I, you know, he showed me how to do everything. And he taught me how to everything, how to harness horses, hook them up, and put things together, and all that.
He pay you? How much did you make then?
Oh, well, I started off with 50 cents a day.
And that was that considered a good deal for a young boy?
Oh yeah, I could buy a Coke for $5. I mean for 5 cents.
Wow, you made 50, so wow. Yeah, you're going.
Yeah,
So-
about, you know, about Coke.
No, I understand.
5 cents.
Right.
Loaf of bread was cheap. Then we used to get the Mary Jane for a
Right.
penny.
Right.
Yeah.
You're like around 20 or something you get married? I'm guessing.
Yeah, I was about between 18 and 19.
Oh, 18, 19, okay. And how did you meet your wife, if I may ask?
Oh my goodness, we went to school together, and she
Right.
lived right above me.
Right.
And she used to help me with my lessons. Never forget.
And that was a very attractive offer. Yeah. Help you with your homework. Right?
Yeah.
So you guys, when you were married, where did you settle down? Where did you start your housekeeping?
Well, I lived with my father and mother for a while.
Sure.
About maybe not quite a year.
Right.
Then right up at where I live at now,
Mm-hmm.
the man offered me this place up there.
Mm-hmm.
And he offered me, he said you need the money, live in Washington,
Right.
$500.
Wow.
For a house?
Yeah.
Wow. So,
Well, I live right now. But I built
Right,
the
in the
house
area.
behind me, and I
Mhm.
built one in front of it.
right.
$500. But my father made me save some money.
Ah.
And my mother. They made me save money. When I worked, I had to save some.
What went into your decision to say, I'm going to stay here in Petersburg?
Well, I had a better job.
Okay.
I worked with Sutter's Beard.
Working with?
Sutter's Beard in Orange, right in Orange. He came from Washington up here. And he built by Reynolds. Right there where Reynolds is at.
Right.
And he offered me a job cleaning the doing, clean cars up and everything. And that's something my father taught me. How to wax cars, clean them up and everything.
Right.
And we used to do that on Sunday. Well, everybody, all the other kids were riding bicycles and things, and we had to work that border, waxing cars and clean them up for people.
James Monroe lives in Little Petersburg to this day. Another resident, Margot Humes, grew up in Little Petersburg, moved away, but then came back, and lives in a house just across from the house where she grew up.
I don't remember too much until maybe I got in first grade, because you didn't have kindergarten or, Head Start, nothing like that. So my early memories, is first grade, going to the old wooden school. I remember the school just like it was yesterday. And I think maybe I was there like a year before we moved into Prospect Heights, the new school. My mother believed in education. She believed in you going to school every day. The neighborhood was a great neighborhood. It was family oriented. Everybody looked out for everybody. And I mean, if you saw your child doing anything, the neighbors would call and report it, and they were allowed to chastise you or whatever. Back in those days, they raised other people's children. I guess the parents went off to work or whatever and had nobody to watch the kids. And my grandfather raised those kids, and I can remember my mother working 4 or 5 houses on that road she worked. And I can remember her, one day I asked her, well, how much money do you make? She said, 50 cents an hour. And I said, oh my, it was just so hard to believe that you would go out and work for 50 cents an hour, but back in those days, hey, I guess that's what it was. So my mom worked very hard, very hard. And I can remember her saying, I didn't even have a decent pair of boots to put on my feet so you all could have good shoes, things like that. And I think she went to maybe about 6 other people lived in the house that my grandfather raised. Yes. And I can't ever remember going hungry. We always had plenty of food on the stove. My grandfather had hogs and chickens and, everything there that we needed. So, like I said, we had a good childhood. Yeah. And I can remember maybe one of the first one had telephone. I know my grandma, my mother didn't have telephone. They used to come to our house and use our phone. And they didn't have TV. They just come to our house and look at the TV. I can't remember a bad day. I really can't. Back then, even though the parents might have been going through a rough time, but the children didn't know. Now, I found out in later years, as I got older, how my mother struggled. But growing up, we didn't know she was struggling. And she was raising 6 of us. She and her father, my grandfather, like my mom was working 2 or 3 jobs, and my grandfather was raising the children. Yes, and as we got older, we started taking care of the younger ones. Yes, so I learned how to cook at a very young age. I mean, we worked so hard as children, because my grandfather raised gardens, and we had to get out there and pick potatoes, tomatoes, and string beans. At that time, we didn't have running water. We had to go to the spring and bring water back to the house. We had to help him mow the grass, because this was a lot of property. So we had to get out there, and there was 6 of us in all. And we didn't believe in those days of putting parents in nursing homes. And when my grandfather got sick, we took care of him at home. My mother worked, and we was like the nurses. We took care of our grandfather. I didn't know my grandma because she died earlier. And, you know, we had to bathe him and everything because he had a stroke. We had to feed him. So our life, we worked as children. I mean, we did have a little time to play, but not a whole lot. And I can remember my mother saying, we would say, well, can we go to so-and-so house? And she would look at us and say, it is 6 of you all. It's enough for you all to play together. You're not going to nobody's house. Don't nobody want y'all in the house dirtying up their house. Yeah, so, you know, we played at home. We played marbles, jacks, baseball, any game that hopscotch, anything you could do outside, we done it. We made wagons and go-karts. We sled ride. And we just had a good childhood, like I said, until I reached the age that I realized it wasn't as good as we thought it was, you know, yeah. And I think as I really started getting older, I don't know, for some reason I knew this wasn't the life I wanted. As a young child, I just didn't want that life. And I always was trying to find a way, how could I get out from this? My sister got killed in a car accident at 17, I was 16. And once she got killed, it was really over with, here for me here. And my grandfather was going to New York one Christmas, and he asked me, you want to ride? He just called me Tut. Tut, you want to ride with me? And I said, yes. And I knew that was my escape. And I packed my clothes, and my mother said, why are you packing so many clothes? I said, well, you know, people in the city, they change 2 or 3 times a day. You know, I just want to make sure I have enough. But I knew what I was going to do. I wasn't coming back. And I went to New York, and I stayed. Just that I didn't want to be in Orange, I think. That was the big thing. Maybe because we worked so hard as children, maybe that's what I was running away from. You know? Maybe I thought I could get some relief from that.
Bruce Monroe also grew up in Little Petersburg. He remembers an idyllic communal society where everyone looked out for each other, where every adult was every child's parent.
I guess I can remember as far back to maybe 3 or 4 years old. It was lots of family living in the area. Actually, I had a grandparents living on either side of me. Both my parents grew up in the neighborhood or lived in the neighborhood most of their lives. Actually, my grandfather used to own most of the property on Little Skyline Drive. And between he and of course the Dade was my mother's family, and the Dades, they owned quite a bit of the whole neighborhood, and they sold them off to individual families. But my understanding was that my great-grandfather, he was like the chief or the mayor of the community. Everyone knew one another. And there was a lot of back and forth, you know. You need eggs, you go get eggs from so-and-so. party lines on the telephone. It might have been 4 or 5 different families on the telephone line. We walked to the store. The store was Gillum's store. And the old bridge before this bridge, we used to walk to the store, and when the cars would come, you could actually feel the breeze of the cars because it wasn't much room between the car and the walking space. You know, the bridge was so narrow. We swam in the Rapidan River, we fished in it. There was a farm, the Shackelford Farm, which is now Willow Grove. That's where we played baseball, in that field. Everyone had fruit trees. We played a lot of, we would organize and play a lot of football, basketball, baseball. So we were pretty active. I started attending school at Prospect Heights. I remember Prospect being a fairly new school, and it was a really, I remember it being very clean.
Tell me a little bit about what life was like in this little community.
Wow. Everyone sort of lived off the land. And it wasn't uncommon for young kids to hunt during that time, because I can remember at about 10 years of age, I had a rifle and I would go out squirrel hunting, and my dad would rabbit hunt. You know, we didn't consider it to be a sport. You know, we actually hunted, fished, and we gardened for. Actually, we did it for food. When I'm thinking back, I can remember my mother. She bought a lot of groceries for, you know, the income and so forth that my father was bringing in. So I'm thinking that maybe the money went a lot farther, and the food must have been a lot cheaper. And a lot of things, you know, we didn't have too many, you know, things that my father, you know, bought as far as expensive toys or anything. You know, we were very creative as far as entertaining ourselves. We would make toys, you know. But it was a real, as far as I'm concerned, it was a real good life. My father gave us, he would buy us clothes at the beginning of the year. We might get a couple outfits for Christmas, and we always got the week's lunch money on Mondays. And I'm thinking it was probably like 15 cents a day for lunch, and he would always give us that. You know, we always had lunch. We always had books, because a lot of kids didn't have books. You know, a lot of them we had to share, but we always had books, and we always had clothes. But we also worked at young ages. My first job was about 10 years old, and I had 2 brothers older, and when they became teenagers, he bought a pickup, a few lawnmowers, and some lawn equipment, and he sent them out to work. And I was just a young kid, and I would go along with them. That was kind of my first job. And as they graduated from school, I went on my own, and I always had work to do. I would walk to Route 15, the stop sign, hitchhike into town, because there was always someone from the neighborhood going into town. I would go in the morning, and I would, most of my jobs were on Rapidan Road down near the high school. And I had different people that I would go work in the flower beds, cut lawns, and that type of thing. That evening, I would walk back uptown, and there was a certain spot people would see you as they were going back to the neighborhood. I would hitchhike back home. And when I wasn't working there, I would go to Woodbury, because you could always go out there and make a few dollars carrying someone's golf clubs. So I was never without a job. I lived here until I was 18. I left in 1974, and that's when I joined the Air Force. I stayed there for 5 years and got out, stayed out for 10 months, and I joined the Air National Guard, and then I had stayed there for about 25 years.
So lots of homes are simply standing empty, and they'll be full of contents, as if time just stood still. Can you speak to that? Because it's not one or two, there's many homes back in the world.
Sure. The reason for that is that, I guess, starting, and I can remember back in the 60s when after high school, kids would leave, because of job opportunities. And of course, one of the biggest employers as far as African Americans during that time was the federal government. So a lot of people from this neighborhood migrated to DC. At least most of my family, most of my uncles and aunts, they ended up in DC or Maryland area, and most of them did pretty well. Now, when they moved, that means that their children grew up in the cities, and they really don't have too much of a connection to the neighborhood except for coming back for their homecoming with their parents, and a lot of them, the kids that moved away, they've started their homes and so forth wherever they moved. But when their parents pass, they've already established the kids. They don't have too much of a connection to this area, so they will hang on to that house and they will pay the taxes. And there are a lot of instances where the families would move back, but they find that a lot of the land was landlocked. And I'm not sure why, but I think that when after the period of slavery, and when people claimed their properties, they were signed the property over to them, but the legal part of right-of-ways and that type of thing was never taken care of. So some of them wanting to move back, but they really can't, without a right-of-way, the land is pretty much useless. You can't build on it.
The church in these freedmen's villages served many functions. In addition to being a house of worship, it was the center of the community. It was a meeting house, a daycare center, and a place where village issues could be discussed. It was a social gathering place.
Yes, I felt it was a social gathering. It's when you get to see everyone and, communicate with them, because like I said, we wasn't allowed to visit. So it was like a honeymoon period on a Sunday when you come in here and you see everyone that you can talk to. Because otherwise you only saw them on the school bus, because we wasn't going to visit nobody at their homes.
And most of it was centered in this church, because that's when people really came together, and it was just, the parents just gave the okay to for other parents to correct their kids.
And if two families had a disagreement over something, how was that resolved?
Most of the time in the church. People would mediate it.
I know that I had to walk from the bottom of the hill down there, up here, and I went to Sunday school here. And every Sunday, when they ring their bell, I had to be in here. Yeah, I used to sing in the choir until one time it had me singing by myself, and I made a mistake and everybody laughed. I haven't sung before, and I haven't sung since.
Who was the influence in your life that sort of resulted in your interest in being a long life steward of the church?
And my mother, and and then her mother and father were very active in the church. Actually, one portion of this church was built by my grandfather. He was and he taught school in the neighborhood, and also he was involved with the church. Never held any office, but he was a builder. Actually, he attended a trade school in Manassas and came back to this neighborhood, and he built the first black school in the area.
Oh, I always loved church. I can remember as a child, I used to sing in the choir up there. And when we would sing some of the songs that we would sing, I remember just passing out a couple of times because I was just so excited about singing these songs. And I still feel that way today. It's just something about that really get to me. And I can remember the elderly sitting all over the church, and my grandfather, he would walk in. I don't know, for some reason he always had to be late coming into church. And he would come into church and he would like stop as he come through the door. And we'd be sitting here, and he would stand right in the middle of the church and look around till he saw all his grandkids. Then he would point us out one by one, and we had to go over there and sit on the front pew. It was so embarrassing. And I used to love our homecoming. Oh yes, that was in August, and during that time it was outside, right out there. And the people would just come from everywhere. It was just a joyful Sunday, and then we had revival 5 days a week, and it was just a beautiful thing. But I love church, and if I don't go to church on a Sunday, I feel like I have to give God some of my time, because if I don't, my week just isn't right. It just seems like nothing works out right if I don't go to church. Yeah.
What are your thoughts? The church, of course, like all churches, not just in Orange, but throughout the states, are dwindling because older people who came more often are passing. Younger people have, not all, but many have a different idea, a different way of worshiping, a different thought about it. So what are your thoughts for the future of this church?
Well, I hope and pray that once we install our new minister, that we will start growing again. And hope and pray that some of the young people will come into the church.
Pretty much all the churches around are having attendance problems, because I think people today, they're really not, I imagine there are so many other things that you can do, options that you have. We've had, I've been in the church when there's been lots of members, and I've come to the conclusion where you don't need many. You just need committed members. If you have a few committed members, I think that you'll be fine. The main thing is to do the things that the church is designed or supposed to do. And if you can do that, then I think that, it can be successful.
The last Sunday in August is homecoming. It's when folks who have roots in Little Petersburg come home to revive their ties to each other, to revive their spirit, and to revive their faith in God.
When it really comes down to it, it comes down to him. You come in, and this man is going to speak something to give you some kind of hope. Okay, and that's what it's about. If he can say something to inspire or to change your mind thought when it's not where it should be, then I think the church is doing what it's supposed to do.
You people who have grown up in Little Petersburg, who've had prosperous and wonderful lives, speaks to the fact that the settlement did have power. It gave people hope, it gave people a dream, and people created plans by which to succeed.